Hi, I'm Michael Odie, a SolarWinds contributor and president of Tekka Inc. And today we're going to look at creating a SQL Server unattended installation using a configuration file. So in this presentation, some of the things we're going to cover, we're going to look at the steps to create an unattended installation and how you actually create that configuration file. Then we'll step through using the SQL Server Configuration Wizard. And then finally, you'll see a demo of actually using that configuration file to perform an unattended setup. So what are the steps that we need to perform? Well, basically, first, you run the SQL Server Installation Center just like you would if you were performing a manual setup. You go through the Setup Wizard screens, you select all the desired options that you want, and then when you get to the end of the setup screen, on the Ready to Install screen, you'll notice there's a configuration file setting at the bottom. That will tell you where your configuration file.ini is located at, which recorded all your configuration settings. Cancel at that point. Then you can go ahead and edit your configuration file.ini, setting in whatever desired options you have to make it run. There's a couple things you need to do to make it run unattended, and I'll show you that in a demo in a second. Then finally, you run the setup.exe program and supply it that configuration file as a parameter. When you run the Setup Wizard, here are some of the important issues that you need to look for. First, you can go ahead and launch the SQL Server standalone installation or add new features to an existing installation option like you see here, but you can also perform the SQL Server failover cluster installation if you want, or the add node to a SQL Server failover cluster. All of these have the ability to create a configuration file. As you step through the wizard and you select the different options that you want, you'll see here on the right side of the screen, you'll get to a Ready to Install SQL Server dialog, and then at the bottom of that dialog, if you hadn't noticed this before, there's a configuration file path, and all of your setup configuration settings will be recorded into that configuration file.ini, and you can then feed that file to the setup.exe program to perform an unattended installation. Alright, let's go ahead and see this in action. Now let's go ahead and create a configuration file that we can use to perform an unattended SQL Server configuration. So first, let's open up SQL Server Installation Center, and on the Installation tab, we're going to go ahead and select New SQL Server Standalone Installation or add features to an existing installation. Remember, as we create this configuration file, this is exactly like walking through a normal manual configuration. The only difference is, and you'll see this at the end, is that we don't complete it. We cancel the installation before we get to the end. So let's go ahead and start our SQL Server configuration. It takes it just a second here to come up with the first screen of the installation wizard. And here it comes. So first it's asking for a product key. We'll go ahead and select the default. Then we'll have to accept the licensing terms. Even though we do this, we are going to have to modify the configuration file. And next, and you'll see how we do that when we get to that point. It's going to ask us to check for updates. In this case, we're going to go ahead and skip that because we're just going through the process to create the config file, not actually performing an update for SQL Server right now. So it'll take it a second as it installs the configuration files and then goes through a rules check. Next, it asks us for the features that we want to install. So we'll make this a relatively simple SQL Server installation. We'll put in database services, we'll put in reporting services, and we'll go ahead and add the management tools. And I think that will probably be it. Now let's go ahead and click Next. And at this point, SQL Server will go through a few checks. Remember, we have to have the prerequisites on to get the installation to work, and in this case that meant the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 needed to be in place. So now let's go ahead and it's performing those checks, and you can see it passed the rules. Now it's asking us for the default instance name. We'll go ahead and keep the default of MS SQL Server. Then when we get to our server configuration screen for ease of setting this up, we'll just go ahead and keep the default account names that the services will run under. We'll keep Windows Authentication Mode and go ahead and add our current user. You'll see this is something we're going to have to change though later in the configuration file because we'll want this to be a little bit more generic. So once we've set that up, we'll go ahead and configure and install reporting services. And at this point it's going to do a final check for the feature rules. And here's the dialog we need to pay attention to, because check out the ready to install feature, and at the bottom of the screen down here you can see the configuration path. This is where all of our settings that we created when we went through the install have been stored. We're going to use this configuration file then to perform an unattended install of SQL Server, and we'll step through that next. So note the location of the configuration file in Program Files SQL Server 120 Setup Bootstrap, and we'll cancel this, and then we'll go ahead and open an instance of Explorer and find that file. So we're headed over to Program Files, and we'll go to SQL Server 120 Setup Bootstrap. And here is the configuration file that we just created. So we're going to go ahead and edit this file next, and we'll open up Notepad to do that. Next, we're going to make a couple of changes here. We are going to make this an unattended install, so we are going to comment out the UI mode setting. We're going to turn quiet on to true. Then, to make this a little more generic, we're going to scroll down and look for our sysadmin setting, because before we added sysadmin and it was specific to this system, but we don't want it to be specific to this system. Instead, we want this to take on the built-in administrator of whatever system we are going to run it on, which doesn't tie us to this system. So let's paste that in. And then we are going to go ahead and add the license agreement portion. Even though we specified it in the interactive part, for some reason it doesn't record it here, so we need to add it manually. So we'll paste that in. Then we'll go ahead and save this configuration file. Next, we're going to use it as part of the setup process. Now let's go ahead and exit out of the installation center. Then we'll go ahead and open up a command prompt to where our configuration file is located at, and it was right here. So we'll open a command prompt here, open command window, there we have it. And now we're going to go ahead and run the setup program and pass in the configuration file parameter along with the path to our configuration file. And now at this point, this will go ahead running setup exe in a command kind of mode using the settings in our configuration file, which are unattended, and it's going to go ahead and perform a setup for SQL Server. And this takes it a little while because it's performing all of the different SQL Server setup tasks. And at this point, it's gone ahead and completed, and you can see our SQL Server installation was completely unattended, and now SQL Server is installed on this system. If we go over to the Start menu and we open it up, we should find an option to go ahead and run SQL Server Management Studio. And here's our new apps, and here we have SQL Server 2014, and down here if we scroll down, here's SQL Server Management Studio. It takes it just a second to load up the user settings for the first time. Then when it fires up, we can go ahead and connect into it. And here you can see our new instance of SQL Server. So our unattended installation was completely successful. And that's the end of this presentation showing how you can perform an unattended SQL Server installation using configuration files. Thank you for watching.